Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of Ravinder Kumar. Imagine the air in North Delhi during the month of July. It is a thick, humid blanket that clings to the skin, carrying the scent of rain-dampened earth and the distant, metallic tang of industrial exhaust. In the year 2015, the nights in the Rohini district were filled with a specific kind of restless energy. The city never truly sleeps, but in the outskirts, in the pockets where the concrete gives way to under-construction skeletons and patches of wild, overgrown wasteland, the silence is different. It is heavy. It is expectant. As the sun dips below the horizon, the sky turns a bruised shade of purple and gold, and the sounds of the day begin to shift. The sharp clatter of machinery fades, replaced by the low, rhythmic thrum of crickets and the occasional bark of a stray dog echoing through the narrow alleys of the labor colonies. In one such corner of Rohini, near the area known as Begumpur, life moves with a humble, steady pulse. Here, the dwellings are often temporary, built by the hands of those who build the city's skyscrapers. The families who live here are hardworking, their lives measured by the rising and setting of the sun and the arrival of the weekly wages. On this particular evening, the atmosphere felt remarkably ordinary. Mothers were beginning to prepare simple meals over small stoves, the smell of charred flour and spices drifting through the open doorways. Children played in the dust of the unpaved streets, their laughter a bright, silver thread woven into the fabric of the twilight. Among them was a young girl, just 6 years old. She was a small presence, a child of the slums with bright eyes and a quick smile, unaware that the shadows stretching across the dirt were growing longer and colder than usual. As the clock moved toward 8 in the evening, the light began to fail completely. The girl told her parents she was going to a nearby open field, a common practice in an area where indoor plumbing was a luxury few could afford. She stepped out of the warmth of her home and into the gathering gloom. The path to the field was familiar, a well-trodden track through the tall, yellowed grass that thrived in the vacant lots between the new brick buildings. To a child, the grass might have seemed like a forest, the stalks reaching up to her shoulders, swaying gently in the hot breeze. She carried with her the innocence of 1,000 similar evenings, a belief that the world she knew was safe and predictable. But somewhere in that darkness, a different kind of presence was waiting. Not a ghost or a phantom, but a man who had mastered the art of becoming invisible in plain sight. 10 minutes passed, then 20. In the small home, the mother looked toward the door. The meal was ready, and the tea was cooling. A subtle flicker of unease began to stir in her chest, a mother's instinct that hums like a low-voltage wire. She called out her daughter's name, her voice carrying over the sounds of the neighbors' televisions and the distant roar of a truck on the main road. There was no answer. She stepped outside, her eyes scanning the dark silhouette of the field. She called again, louder this time, her voice tightening with a sharp edge of worry. Still, the only response was the rustle of the wind in the dry weeds. She walked a few paces toward the field, her sandals crunching on the gravel. The darkness there was absolute, a void that seemed to swallow the light from the nearby street lamps. By the time 30 minutes had elapsed, the quiet evening had fractured. The father joined the search, grabbing a small, plastic flashlight that threw a weak, flickering beam of yellow light against the darkness. They moved into the field, their voices rising in a frantic chorus. Neighbors, sensing the shift in the air, began to emerge from their homes. In these communities, the disappearance of a child is a shared nightmare, a collective fear that brings everyone to their feet. Soon, a dozen flashlights were cutting through the night, their beams dancing like nervous fireflies. They searched the edges of the construction sites, the deep trenches dug for sewage pipes, and the piles of abandoned bricks. They called the girl's name until their throats were raw, but the silence that followed each shout was deafening. It was a silence that felt heavy, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. The searchers moved deeper into the wasteland, their feet sinking into the soft, muddy patches where the monsoon rains had collected. Every shadow looked like a crouching figure. Every rustle of a plastic bag caught in a thorn bush sounded like a soft footfall. They checked the abandoned shells of buildings, where the concrete felt cold and damp against their palms. The air was thick with the smell of wet cement and stagnant water. They looked into the deep, dark mouths of the open drains, their hearts pounding with the dread of what they might find. But there was nothing. No dropped shoe, no torn piece of clothing, no sign of a struggle. It was as if the girl had simply evaporated into the humid Delhi air. The police were eventually notified, their sirens a jarring, discordant sound in the residential quiet, but even their arrival brought no clarity. As the hours stretched toward midnight, a grim exhaustion began to settle over the crowd. The initial frantic energy had transitioned into a hollow, aching desperation. The parents sat on the dirt outside their home, their faces illuminated by the harsh, artificial light of the police lanterns. The search area was expanded to a radius of several kilometers, covering the desolate stretches of land that bordered the neighboring sectors of Rohini. They didn't know then that they were searching for a predator who could walk 40 kilometers in a single night without tiring. They didn't know that this was not an isolated tragedy, but a single thread in a dark tapestry that had been woven across the city for 7 long years. As the first hint of gray light began to touch the eastern sky, the search yielded nothing but a profound sense of loss. The quiet evening in Rohini had ended, and a long, cold morning of realization was beginning to dawn. The heavy, stifling air of that midnight vigil in the city feels like a world away from the dust-choked lanes of the village, where Ravinder first learned to walk. To understand the man who would one day haunt the construction sites of the capital, we must pull back the curtain of time and look toward the quiet fields of Sampla. In the early 1990s, life in this corner of Haryana moved with the slow, rhythmic pace of the seasons. The sun would beat down upon the parched earth, turning the horizon into a shimmering haze of heat and gold. It was a place where silence was not a luxury, but a constant companion. In a small, modest house, Ravinder lived a life that seemed, at least on the surface, entirely unremarkable. His father, a plumber named Brahmanand, spent his days wrestling with lead pipes and rusted valves, his hands stained by the grime of his trade. His mother, Manju, worked as a domestic help, moving from one household to another to scrub floors and wash linens. They were people of the earth, defined by the weight of their labor and the constant, quiet struggle to keep their heads above the rising tide of poverty. In the cramped quarters of their home, young Ravinder was often left to his own devices. His parents were stretched thin, their energies consumed by the grueling demands of survival. This left a void in the boy's life, a lack of attention that began to manifest in a growing sense of isolation. As he walked the narrow paths of Sampla, past the hovels and the open drains, he was a child who appeared to fade into the background. He was the boy who sat on the edges of the playground, watching the other children with a gaze that was difficult to read. There was no wealth here, only the shared understanding of hard work and the occasional sweet reward of a few copper coins. The village, with its low-slung buildings and the smell of wood smoke and cattle, should have been a sanctuary. Instead, for Ravinder, it was the birthplace of a profound and growing detachment. He was a school dropout, having left his education behind after only the 6th grade. The classroom could not hold his interest, and the world of books and numbers felt like a language he simply did not care to speak. By the time he reached his teenage years, the quiet boy from Sampla had become a young man of few words and hidden impulses. The rural landscape, while beautiful in its starkness, offered little in the way of opportunity for a boy who had turned his back on learning. He began to drift, spending his days wandering the outskirts of the village where the cultivated fields met the wild, unkempt scrubland. It was during these long, solitary hours that something within him began to shift. The crushing weight of his family's financial situation meant that every day was a reminder of what he lacked. He saw his father's exhaustion and his mother's weary eyes, and he felt the sting of being insignificant in a world that valued strength and success. He began to seek solace in the shadows, finding a strange comfort in the anonymity of the tall grass and the abandoned structures that dotted the countryside. There were no grand signs of the darkness to come, only a gradual turning inward, a hardening of the heart that went unnoticed by those around him. In 2008, at the age of 18, Ravinder decided it was time to leave the familiar dust of Sampla behind. The city of Delhi, with its promises of work and its endless, teeming millions, beckoned like a fever dream. He packed his meager belongings and boarded a train, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks sounding like a countdown to a new life. He arrived in the capital not as a conqueror, but as another faceless laborer in a sea of migrant workers. The transition was jarring. The wide, open skies of the village were replaced by the jagged silhouettes of half-finished high-rises and the suffocating gray of the slums. He found work near the construction sites of Samipur badly, a place defined by the screech of cranes and the constant, fine rain of cement dust. Here, he was a daily wage laborer, a truck helper, a man who moved heavy stones and metal rods until his muscles screamed for relief. He lived in the shanties, where the air was thick with the smell of kerosene and the sound of 1,000 voices competing for space. The city did not offer Ravinder the salvation he might have hoped for. Instead, the anonymity of the urban sprawl provided a perfect mask for the dark appetites that had begun to take root. In the evenings, after the grueling work of the day was done, he would lose himself in the haze of cheap alcohol and marijuana. It was in these moments of intoxication that the boundaries of his morality began to dissolve. He found himself drawn to the seedy underbelly of the city, discovering the forbidden allure of blue films on old video cassettes. These grainy, flickering images fed a depravity that had been simmering in the quiet corners of his mind since his youth. He was no longer the invisible boy from Sampla. In the darkness of his shared room, he was becoming a predator, fueled by a toxic mixture of addiction and a growing resentment toward the world that had seemingly forgotten him. The transition from laborer to monster was not a sudden leap, but a slow, agonizing slide down a slope of his own making. He would spend his nights walking. It became a ritual, a way to vent the restless energy that the labor could not exhaust. He would walk for miles, his footsteps echoing through the industrial areas of Bawana and the desolate patches of land near the metro construction sites. He observed the families living in the slums, the children playing in the dirt with nothing but a few stones and their imagination. He saw their vulnerability, their lack of protection, and he saw an opportunity. The first time he crossed the line, it was in the year 2008, shortly after his arrival. The details are a chilling testament to how quickly the shadow took hold. He found that a simple 10 rupee note or a handful of colorful sweets was all it took to lure a child away from the safety of the crowd. In the vast, uncaring expanse of the city, the boy from Sampla had found his hunting ground. The silence of the village was gone, replaced by a much darker silence, one that he would enforce with his own hands, time and time again, as he began a journey into the heart of human depravity. The outskirts of the capital are often defined by a peculiar, heavy silence. In the districts of Begumpur and Rohini, the air carries a fine, persistent dust from the construction sites that rise like skeletal monuments against the horizon. For several years, between 2008 and 2015, this dust did more than just settle on the roads. It settled on the growing stacks of paper inside the local police outposts. These were the missing person files, each one containing the name of a child who had simply vanished into the haze of the afternoon. At first, there was no reason to believe these absences were connected. The world of the laborers and the migrant workers is one of constant movement, and the authorities often viewed a missing child through a lens of tragic dismissiveness. They saw runaways, They saw children who had wandered too far and boarded a train to a different life. But the files were beginning to whisper a different story, a story of missing pieces that refused to be ignored any longer. If you were to stand in the center of the precinct and look at the map of the Northwest District, you would see a pattern of shadows. One disappearance in Samipur badly, another in Bawana, and then a report from the crowded lanes of Nerla. Each case was a small tragedy, isolated by the distance of a few miles and the bureaucratic walls that separated one jurisdiction from the next. The investigators were dealing with a landscape that was constantly changing. New buildings were being erected every day, and the earth was always being moved, turned over, and flattened. It was a perfect environment for things to remain hidden. In the quiet hours of the night, the officers on duty would flip through the folders, looking at the grainy photographs of 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds. They noticed a chilling commonality in the descriptions. The children were almost always from the poorest families, the ones whose voices were the quietest when they cried out for help. And in many of the statements, there was a mention of a stranger, a soft-spoken man who walked the streets when the sun began to dip below the horizon. The realization began to take hold like a slow-burning fever. It wasn't a sudden epiphany, but rather a gradual accumulation of details that didn't fit the narrative of a runaway. In 2014, a year before the full scale of the horror was revealed, a small boy was found alive in a septic tank near a building project. He had been attacked, his throat cut, left for dead in the dark, damp silence of the underground. This should have been the final piece of the puzzle, the clue that tied the wandering laborer to the violence that was haunting the slums. At the time, a man named Ravinder was detained, but the system, sluggish and overwhelmed, let him slip through its fingers. He was granted bail, and the file was tucked away, becoming just another sheet of paper covered in the gray dust of the station. The authorities failed to see that the survivor in the septic tank was the living testimony of a predator who was refining his methods with every passing month. Visualize the evidence lockers in those days. They were filled with the remnants of childhoods interrupted. A single plastic shoe found near a drainage ditch, a torn shirt caught on a rusted fence, and the most haunting clue of all, the crinkle of a cheap candy wrapper. The reports started to mention that children were being lured with small sweets, toffees that cost only a few paisa, or perhaps a crisp 10-rupee note held out in a calloused hand. These were the simple tools of a monster who understood the geography of hunger and hope. The police began to realize that the man they were looking for wasn't a ghost. He was someone who lived among the people, someone who blended into the crowds of laborers returning home from a long day of work. The missing pieces were no longer just names on a board. They were coordinates on a map that were beginning to cluster around the same few square miles of outer Delhi. The investigators started to wonder how many other children had been lost to this shadow, and the numbers they were beginning to whisper to one another were terrifying. By the early months of 2015, the tension in the air was palpable. The mothers in the slums of Begumpur no longer let their children play near the construction sites after 4 o'clock. There was a sense of a presence, a weight that hung over the neighborhood. The police had finally begun to link the cases, creating a special investigation team to look at the disappearances across 5 different districts. They were looking for a man who walked. A man who could cover 30 or 40 kilometers in a single night, drifting from one slum to another, never staying in the same place long enough to leave a permanent mark. They realized that he was using the city's growth as his camouflage, moving through the half-finished apartments and the piles of bricks like a spirit of the wasteland. Each new report was a jagged fragment of a larger, much darker picture. The pieces were coming together, revealing the profile of a predator who had been hunting in plain sight for 7 long years. The silence was finally being broken, and the truth that was about to emerge would shake the capital to its very core. The outskirts of Delhi are a place where the city seems to lose its breath. Here, in the industrial stretches of Nerla and Bawana, The towering skyline of the urban center fades into a hazy, jagged landscape of gray concrete and yellow dust. This is the industrial belt, a vast expanse of half-finished factories and abandoned construction sites that stand like hollow ribcages against the scorched sky. In the summer of 2015, these wastelands were not just empty spaces. They were becoming a silent graveyard. The heat was relentless, a thick and suffocating blanket that trapped the scent of dry earth, rusted iron, and stagnant water. In these quiet zones, the bustling life of the nearby slums felt miles away. Yet it was here that the most harrowing evidence would finally surface, shifting the focus of the police from a search for the missing to a hunt for a cold-blooded killer. The shift began with a single site in Bigumpur, an under-construction building that had been left to the elements. The police had been searching for a 6-year-old girl who had vanished just days before, on July 14, 2015. As the investigators moved through the skeletal structure, their boots crunched on broken bricks and discarded rebar. The air inside the unfinished rooms was still and heavy with the metallic tang of drying cement and the smell of ancient dust. They found her in the deep shadows of the basement, and the atmosphere immediately changed. This was no longer a simple search for a runaway child. The marks on her small frame and the brutal, clinical nature of her end signaled something far more calculated. The officers stood in the dim light of their flashlights, realizing that the predator they were looking for was not just a common criminal, but someone who knew the silence of these industrial ruins perfectly. As the investigation deepened, the focus of the search teams expanded into the surrounding wastelands. In these industrial fringes, open pits and unfinished septic tanks are common, often hidden by thick overgrowth or piles of construction debris. One such tank held a memory that still haunted the local officers. They recalled a previous case where a young boy had been found bleeding, but miraculously alive in a similar pit months earlier. He had survived a terrible assault, but at the time, his ordeal had been treated as an isolated incident of local violence. Now, looking at the fresh crime scene in July 2015, the threads began to pull together. The physical evidence, the way a body was positioned, the specific pattern of strangulation, and the discarded items found nearby, began to form a map of a killer's movements through the empty lots and factory shells. The moment the case officially transitioned into a homicide hunt was marked by a chilling scene at the station houses of Outer Delhi. Detectives began pulling dusty files from Nerla, Samipur Badli, and Kanjhawala. They spread these folders across wooden tables under the hum of ceiling fans, looking at the dates and the grainy photographs of missing children from years past. Every name represented a child of a poor laborer, someone whose disappearance might have been briefly noted but never fully understood. But as they plotted the locations of the discoveries on a map of the wastelands, the truth became undeniable. There was a monster moving through the shadows of the factories, a man who would walk as many as 40 kilometers a day, hunting for the most vulnerable among the ruins. The search for the missing was over. The pursuit of a serial killer had begun. By the time the suspect, Ravinder Kumar, was brought into custody, the physical evidence in the wastelands began to corroborate the unthinkable. He did not just admit to one crime. He spoke of 30, then 36. He described the spots with a terrifying, vivid accuracy. The exact corner of an abandoned factory, the specific height of the grass in a field where he had left a body, the exact slope of a pond's bank. The police followed his descriptions into the heart of the darkness, finding skeletal remains and tattered pieces of clothing that had been hidden for years. The scale of the hunt grew so large that it felt as though the entire landscape of Outer Delhi was finally speaking, revealing the horrors that had been buried beneath its dust for nearly a decade. Each discovery was a heavy stone added to the weight of the case, a physical testament to a nightmare that had lived in the gaps of the city's progress. The investigation forever transformed the way the community looked at its industrial fringes. These wastelands were no longer just empty plots of land awaiting development. They were a reminder of a deep, systemic failure to protect the innocent. As the sun set over the jagged horizon of the factories in Nerla, casting long, orange shadows across the gravel, the families of the missing gathered to wait for news. They watched the flashlights of the forensic teams dancing in the distance like restless fireflies. They had found the evidence, and they had found the man, but the true scope of the tragedy was still unfolding in the quiet, desolate corners of the city's edge. The shift was absolute. The search for the lost had turned into a long, painful road toward justice for the victims who had been left behind in the dust. The sun sets over the industrial corridors of North Delhi, casting long, jagged shadows across half-finished concrete. Following the realization that the industrial fringes were no longer just empty plots of land, we look closer at the air, thick with the fine, orange dust of construction. This gritty veil settles on the skin and muffles the sounds of the distant city. Here, the skeletal frames of apartment blocks stand like silent giants, their empty windows staring over the wastelands. In the spaces between the thriving city and the forgotten dirt, a shadow began to move. It was a presence so subtle, so integrated into the daily grind of manual labor, that it remained invisible for a long time. Thousands of people arrive every day from distant villages searching for a wage, making a new face just another soul in the tide. To the casual observer, the man was nobody, but to the darkness of the city, he was becoming a nightmare. Eventually, the silence began to break. Whispers rose among the bricklayers and cement mixers over small fires in the cooling air. They spoke of a man who did not seem to belong to any specific crew, yet was always there, lingering near the edges of the site. He was slightly built, unremarkable in every way, wearing the same sweat-stained clothes as everyone else. Eyewitnesses later recalled seeing him near the deep pits of septic tanks or the shadowed corners of unfinished basements. He moved with a quiet, purposeful gait, his eyes always scanning the horizon for opportunity. To the transient families living in temporary shacks, he was just part of the background noise of progress, a ghost in a city that never stops building. They did not know that the man standing near the scaffolding was watching their children with a predatory focus. The task of the investigators was monumental. In the heart of areas like Nerla and Bawana, the population is like water, constantly shifting and flowing. A family might live in Alinta for 2 months while a foundation is poured, then vanish overnight when the work moves to a new sector. This transience created a perfect shroud for a predator. When a child went missing, the tragedy often remained unrecorded. Many parents, fearing the complexity of the law or simply needing to follow the next job to survive, would pack their meager belongings and move to another state, leaving their heartbreak behind. The police found themselves searching for a needle in a shifting haystack. There were no permanent addresses here, no digital footprints, only the fading memory of a face seen for a few seconds under a flickering street lamp. There was one moment that pierced through the fog and offered a terrifying glimpse into the truth. A young boy, barely 6 years old, was found bleeding inside the concrete belly of a septic tank at an under-construction building. He had survived an ordeal that should have claimed his life, serving as a living testament to the darkness prowling the industrial fringes. This discovery in Begumpur should have ended the mystery, but the shadow was clever. He was a casual laborer himself, someone who knew the rhythms of the site and exactly where the security was thin. He would stay in one area for 2 or 3 months, just long enough to learn the terrain and find his marks, before vanishing and reappearing in a new sector miles away. He was a driver, an assistant, a helper, a hidden part of the city's vast machinery. The eyewitness accounts gathered over several years began to form a chilling pattern. They spoke of a man who offered a 10-rupee note or colorful candies to children playing in the dirt. He was patient, waiting for the specific moments when parents were distracted by the heavy lifting of stones or the sifting of sand. He understood that in these industrial zones, children were often left to create their own worlds among the rubble. The accounts described him as one of us, a man who spoke the same language and shared the same dust. It was this familiarity that made him so dangerous. He did not hide in the bushes. He walked through the front gate, nodding to guards, and blending into the very crowd that was meant to protect the community from harm. As the investigation deepened, the scale of his movement became clear. The shadow had been active across Delhi, Haryana, and Uttar Pradesh for nearly 7 years. He had traversed hundreds of miles, often walking 40 kilometers in a single night to find a place that felt safe for his darkness. Each construction site was a new opportunity where no one knew his face or his past. The difficulty of tracking a suspect in such a fluid environment was immense. By the time a report was finally filed, the suspect had often collected his meager wages and moved on to a different district. The skeletal buildings, meant to be symbols of a rising nation, had instead become hunting grounds for a man who moved as softly as the orange wind through the girders. The investigation was not just a search for a person, but a battle against the anonymity of the modern metropolis. The predator was not a monster lurking in the woods, but a man sitting on the bus, his hands rough from a day's labor. The shadow in the crowd was only visible if you knew exactly where to look, and for years, the city had been looking the other way. As we continue, we will see how a single piece of evidence, a small slip of paper left in the dirt near a victim, finally began to pull the veil away from the face of Ravinder Kumar and the true horror of his journey. The air in the July of 2015 was thick, even by the standards of New Delhi. It was a heat that didn't just sit on your skin. It seemed to inhabit the very space between people, making every movement in the crowded lanes of Begumpur feel labored and heavy. On the 14th of that month, the routine of the neighborhood was shattered by a silence that no parent ever wants to hear. A 6-year-old girl had vanished from near her home. In a city of millions, a child's disappearance can sometimes be treated as a tragic but isolated statistic. Yet the local police felt a distinct, chilling pressure. There was a rhythm to this absence that felt intentional, a void that had been carved out of the community before, though they didn't yet know by whom. The investigation wasn't just about a single missing person anymore. It was about a shadow that had been lengthening over North India for 7 long years. The tactical response was led by the Outer Delhi Police, centered in a small, buzzing station, where the ceiling fans hummed a low, constant rhythm that failed to cool the room. Deputy Commissioner Vikram Singh moved through the station with a quiet intensity. He knew that the traditional methods were failing. To catch someone who moves through the slums like a ghost, you cannot rely solely on paperwork or forensic labs that take weeks to return a result. You have to become part of the landscape. They began a process of community outreach that was less about public meetings and more about embedding the law into the very fabric of the streets. Officers shed their stiff khakis for the worn cotton shirts and sandals of local laborers. They sat in the small tea stalls, listening not for a name, but for a description, a detail about a man who lingered too long near the half-finished skeletons of new buildings. The breakthrough came from a painstaking review of technology and human intelligence. Investigators didn't have a high-definition digital grid to work with. Instead, they had dozens of private CCTV cameras, many of them grainy, tucked under the eaves of small shops or overlooking dusty intersections. One by one, they watched hundreds of hours of footage. It was a test of patience, watching the mundane flow of life, the cycles, the stray dogs, the delivery trucks, until a pattern emerged. They saw a figure, slight of build, who seemed to appear in the periphery of several locations where children had gone missing. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like any other day-wage laborer, the kind of man who blends into the background of a growing city. But his movements were purposeful, always orbiting the fringes of the slums and the under-construction zones where the oversight was thin and the shadows were deep. As the police tightened their net, they leaned heavily on their network of informers. These were the men and women who lived in the margins, the street vendors and the rickshaw pullers who saw everything but were rarely asked. The police showed these contacts the grainy stills from the cameras. Slowly, a name began to circulate through the whispers of the Begumper alleys: Ravinder. They learned he was a 30-year-old man who had moved from Kasganj in Uttar Pradesh years ago. He was known for working odd jobs and for a troubling habit of disappearing into the bottle. The outreach program finally paid off when a tip came in regarding his whereabouts. He wasn't hiding in a fortress. He was hiding in plain sight, frequenting the transit points where the city's transient population gathered to find work or catch a ride out of the district. On July 16, 2015, the operation moved from the shadows to the street. The location was the Sukhbir Nagar bus stand in the Rohini area. It was a place of constant motion, the smell of diesel fumes and fried snacks hanging in the humid air. Plainclothes officers positioned themselves around the stand, appearing as travelers or workers waiting for a late afternoon bus. When Ravinder Kumar appeared, he didn't run. He walked with the nonchalance of a man who believed he was invisible. The moment the officers closed in, the atmosphere changed. The casual noise of the bus stand died down as he was intercepted. There was no grand chase, only the quiet, firm click of handcuffs and the sudden, sharp realization that the predator had been found. He was taken back to the Begumper station, the very place where the maps of the missing children were pinned to the walls. The interrogation began in a small, dimly lit room. At first, the focus was entirely on the 6-year-old girl who had vanished 2 days prior. But as the officers questioned him, the man before them began to speak with a terrifying lucidity. He led them to a nearby under-construction building, a skeletal structure of concrete and rebar. There, in a hidden corner of the site, they found the girl's body. It was a devastating moment for the search team, but as Ravinder began to talk, the detectives realized that this was not the end of a single investigation. It was the opening of a tomb. He began to recount other locations: Nerla, Bawana, Alipur. He spoke of dates and specific details that only a killer could know, describing the way he would lure children with candy or small amounts of money before leading them into the dark. The net had closed on Ravinder Kumar, but in doing so, it had revealed a scale of tragedy that would haunt the city for years to come. The air in North Delhi was heavy, a thick blanket of humidity that seemed to press against the chest before the sun had even considered rising. It was July 19th, 2015. In the winding, unpaved alleys of Samipur Badly, the usual sounds of the early morning, the distant bark of a stray dog or the low hum of a cooling fan, felt muted, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. Unmarked police vehicles crept through the shadows, their wheels crunching softly over the uneven earth. Their headlights were extinguished to avoid drawing any unwanted attention from the sleepers in the surrounding tenements. The men inside these vehicles were silent, their faces illuminated only by the faint, bluish glow of their mobile screens. They were moving toward a target that had eluded them for years, a ghost whose presence was felt only in the tragic, hollow absences he left behind in the homes of the poor. The operation was a work of quiet precision, a calculated orchestration of law enforcement closing a net around a single, unremarkable dwelling. This was not the grand lair of a villain from a cinematic thriller. It was a modest, cramped space nestled deep within the dense sprawl of construction sites and laborers' quarters. The ground here was uneven, littered with the forgotten remnants of broken brick, rusted rebar, and the fine gray dust that characterizes a city in a constant, restless state of building and rebuilding. As the officers stepped out of their cars, their heavy boots made almost no sound on the soft, sun-baked earth. They moved in a single, disciplined file, appearing like shadows among shadows, drifting toward the doorway where Ravinder Kumar lay sleeping. He was tucked away in the heart of the very community he had been preying upon, unaware that his long, horrific season of predator and prey was finally coming to an abrupt and final end. The knock at the door was not the thunderous, splintering boom of a battering ram that one might expect in a high-stakes raid. Instead, it was a sharp, authoritative series of raps that sliced through the pre-dawn stillness like a blade. When the door finally creaked open on its worn hinges, the officers were met not with a desperate struggle or a frantic attempt at an escape through a back window, but with a chilling, hollow silence. Inside, the room was small, cramped, and smelled faintly of old spices, stagnant air, and the sharp, medicinal tang of cheap country liquor. There, in the dim, sickly light of a single, flickering overhead bulb, stood Ravinder. He was a man of slight build, appearing much younger than his 24 years. His frame was thin, almost fragile, with narrow shoulders and slender hands that made the knowledge of his horrific strength and the violence he had visited upon children all the more unsettling to those standing in his presence. He stood there, blinking slowly, his eyes adjusting to the harsh beams of the flashlights now trained directly on his face. What struck the officers most in those first few seconds was the absolute lack of adrenaline or fear radiating from the man. There was no racing pulse visible in the hollow of his neck, no widening of the pupils in terror, no sweat breaking out on his brow. Ravinder Kumar looked at the authorities with a gaze that was disturbingly blank, a flat, obsidian stare that suggested he had been expecting them for a very, very long time. As the lead investigator stepped forward, the metallic chime of the handcuffs echoed off the bare, unpainted walls, a sharp, cold sound that seemed to vibrate in the small, oppressive space. Ravinder did not pull away or flinch from the touch of the law. He did not shout his innocence, nor did he plead for mercy or ask what was happening. He simply extended his wrists, his movements slow, deliberate, and almost cooperative, as if he were participating in a mundane, everyday transaction. The clicking of the steel ratchets as they tightened around his bony wrists was the only sound for a long, heavy moment. One click, then two, then three. The metal was bitingly cold against his skin, a stark contrast to the stifling, airless heat of the room. One of the officers noticed how incredibly steady Ravinder's hands were as they were bound together. There was no tremor of anxiety, no sign of the physical nerves that almost always accompany a high-stakes arrest. Instead, there was a sense of profound, almost clinical detachment, a psychological distance that made the air in the room feel even colder. He looked down at the handcuffs not with the shame of a captured criminal, but with a strange, quiet curiosity, as if the shiny metal rings were merely an interesting new development in a long, dark story he had been telling himself for years. As they led him out of the house and back into the alleyway, the sky was beginning to turn a pale, dusty shade of lavender and gray. The first hints of the July dawn were bleeding into the horizon, casting a flat, unforgiving light over the neighborhood. A few neighbors had begun to emerge from their homes, clutching their morning tea in tin cups, their faces masked with a mixture of confusion and curiosity as they watched the slight, unremarkable man being escorted toward the waiting car. They saw a neighbor, a quiet daily wage laborer, someone who mostly kept to himself and blended into the background of the slums. They could not yet see the monster who had confessed in the silence of his own mind to the destruction of 30 young lives. Ravinder walked with his head slightly bowed, his pace rhythmic and steady, perfectly matching the stride of the men who held firmly to his arms. He was placed into the back seat of the primary vehicle, flanked on either side by 2 officers who found themselves unable to look away from the man who appeared so profoundly, terrifyingly ordinary. The engine hummed to life, vibrating through the frame of the car, and as the vehicle began to pull away from the dusty curb, Ravinder looked out the window one last time at the place where he had hidden in plain sight. His expression remained entirely unchanged, no tears of regret, no flashes of anger, just a quiet, terrifying stillness. This was the calm before the storm of his confessions, a silence that suggested the horrors he was about to recount were, to him, Nothing more than the simple, cold facts of a life lived entirely within the shadows of the human soul. The iron gate of the precinct closed with a heavy, final thud, echoing through the humid night air of July, 2015. Inside, the station was a labyrinth of dim yellow light and the rhythmic whirring of ceiling fans that seemed to struggle against the oppressive heat of Delhi. Ravinder was led through the corridors, his footsteps light and almost rhythmic on the dusty floorboards. He was no longer the phantom of the construction sites or the shadow in the fields. Here, under the buzzing fluorescent tubes, he was just a man in a rumpled shirt, yet the air around him felt strangely cold. The officers guided him toward a small, windowless space tucked away at the end of the hall. It was a place the investigators quietly referred to as the Room of Truth. It was not a place of comfort, but a place of reckoning, where the walls seemed to lean in, waiting for the weight of secrets to finally break the silence. The room was sparse, containing only a scarred wooden table and 2 chairs that creaked under the slightest movement. There were no windows to offer a glimpse of the moonlit city outside, only the peeling green paint and the smell of old paper and stale tea. Ravinder sat down, his expression unreadable, his eyes reflecting the single, naked bulb hanging from the ceiling. Across from him sat Deputy Commissioner Vikramjit Singh, a man whose career had seen much, but nothing quite like the void staring back at him now. For the first hour, there was only a thick, suffocating silence. The investigators watched the way Ravinder adjusted his posture, the way he didn't fidget, and the way his hands rested perfectly still on the table. It was a psychological stalemate, a quiet battle of wills where every breath felt like a calculated move in a high-stakes game of chess. Slowly, the silence was pierced by the sound of a folder opening. One by one, the investigators began to lay out photographs on the table. They were not images of crime scenes, but portraits of children, faces full of innocence and light. They spoke the names of the missing from Samipur Badli, from Begumpur, and from the dusty stretches of Vijay Vihar. They talked about a 6-year-old girl who had gone to a field on a Tuesday night and never returned. At first, Ravinder remained defiant, his voice a low, gravelly whisper as he denied any knowledge. But the investigators were patient. They didn't shout. They simply described the texture of the candy he used as a lure, the crinkle of the wrappers, and the small, 10-rupee notes he would hold out to the children who played near the construction sites. They described the country-made liquor he favored, the way it changed him, and how he would wander for 40 kilometers through the dark, hunting for a target. As the night stretched into the early hours of the morning, the atmosphere in the Room of Truth shifted. The humidity seemed to intensify, and the sound of the city outside faded into a distant, muffled hum. Ravinder's composure began to fray at the edges. He started to speak about a different version of himself, a man who emerged only after the first bottle of liquor was finished. He described this other person as someone he couldn't control, a shadow that took over his body and his mind. He spoke of the construction sites where the earth was soft and the tall grass offered a place to hide. The investigators leaned in, their pens hovering over their notebooks. They realized they weren't just looking for one victim anymore. The numbers began to climb, 1, 5, 10, 15. Each time he spoke, the gravity of his words seemed to pull the oxygen out of the room, leaving the officers breathless in the face of such casual, detached cruelty. Then came the moment that would haunt the investigators for years to come. Ravinder looked at a photograph of a young girl from Samipur Badli and nodded slowly. He didn't just confess. He began to narrate the events with a terrifying, vivid accuracy. He described the exact spots where he had left them, the way the wind felt that night, and the silence of the children when they realized the man with the sweets was not a friend. He claimed that he had taken the lives of more than 30 children over the span of 7 years. The air in the room grew heavy with the collective weight of those 30 souls. He spoke of his first crime in 2008, when he was only 17 years old, and how the lack of consequences back then had emboldened him. It was a confession born not of guilt, but of a strange, twisted pride in his own invisibility. By the time the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a pale gray light through the station's distant corridors, the room of truth had fulfilled its purpose. The mask had been stripped away, revealing a predator who had walked among the most vulnerable for nearly a decade. Ravinder sat back in his chair, seemingly exhausted by the honesty he had finally surrendered. The investigators, however, felt a different kind of exhaustion, the kind that comes from staring into an abyss and seeing it stare back. They had the confessions, they had the locations, and they had the names. But as they led Ravinder out of that small, cramped room, the silence he left behind was louder than any scream. The battle in the room was over, but the journey into the dark fields to bring those children home was only just beginning. The dawn light was a cruel witness that morning. It did not bring the warmth of a new beginning, but rather a cold, clinical clarity to the small, cramped room within the Begumper police station. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of gray light that filtered through the high, barred windows, swirling around the heavy air that smelled of stale tea, cheap cigarettes, and the mounting weight of an unthinkable reality. Across the scarred wooden table sat Ravinder Kumar. He was a man of only 24 years, appearing unremarkable, almost fragile in his stillness. But as the sun continued its slow ascent over the sprawling outskirts of Delhi, the silence that had once protected his secrets began to fracture. The investigators, led by Deputy Commissioner Vikram Singh, watched the young man closely. They had brought him in for the disappearance of a single 6-year-old girl, but as the minutes ticked by, the gravity in the room shifted. It became clear that they were not just looking at a suspect, but at a living archive of a decade of darkness. Ravinder did not shout. He did not cry or plead for mercy. Instead, his voice was a flat, rhythmic monotone, as if he were reciting a list of mundane chores rather than a tally of lives stolen. He began to speak of the shadows where he walked. He described the construction sites near Samipur Badli and the narrow, winding alleys of Vijay Vihar. He spoke of the year 2008, the time when the first darkness took hold of him. He was only 17 then, a laborer wandering the edges of a city that often forgot its poorest residents. He admitted to the officers that before he went out into the night, he would consume large amounts of country liquor, a burning, cheap alcohol that he claimed numbed his mind and sharpened his predatory instincts. With a chilling detachment, he explained how he would walk for miles, sometimes up to 40 kilometers in a single night, hunting through the slums for the most vulnerable among us. The officers felt the air grow thin as the number of victims began to rise. At first, there were 5. Then, with a casual nod, Ravinder mentioned 15. The scratching of the detective's pen across the yellowed notebook paper was the only sound in the room, a frantic, rhythmic ticking that struggled to keep pace with the mounting horror. By the time the clock on the wall reached 7 in the morning, the count had climbed to 30, then 36. Each number represented a child, most between the ages of 4 and 6, who had simply vanished from the face of the earth. He told them how he used small bribes, handfuls of colorful candy, cheap chocolates, or a few coins, to lure them away from the safety of their shanties and construction camps. He took them to the forgotten places, abandoned buildings, deep forest patches, and the edges of stagnant ponds. There, in the absolute silence of the night, he would end their lives before they could even understand the nature of the monster standing before them. Perhaps the most haunting moment of the confession came when Ravinder began to describe a crime in Hathras, a village far from the capital. He recounted the abduction and murder of a 5-year-old girl in the year 2013 with such vivid, terrifying accuracy that the investigators were left stunned. They realized that for 2 years, another man, the girl's own father, had been rotting in a jail cell, wrongly accused of the very crime Ravinder was now describing with a ghost of a smile. This was the moment the scale of his violence truly shattered the room. He wasn't just a killer. He was a void that had swallowed families whole, allowing the innocent to suffer for his depravity. He remembered the exact locations where he had left the bodies, describing the tilt of a wall or the presence of a specific tree, details that only the true architect of the tragedy could possibly know. The police realized that many of these children had never even been reported missing. Their families, too poor or too frightened to seek help from a system that often looked the other way. As the tally reached toward 40, a heavy, suffocating realization settled over the station. The map of Delhi and its surrounding districts, Noida, Haryana, and Uttar Pradesh, was being rewritten in blood. The places people lived, worked, and raised their children were now marked by the invisible footprints of a man who had moved through them like a ghost for 7 years. The investigators looked at Ravinder, searching for a sign of remorse, a flicker of human feeling in those cold eyes, but they found nothing. He was, as they would later describe, a predator with no sense of guilt. Outside the room, the city was fully awake now. The sounds of traffic and the calls of street vendors drifted in, a sharp contrast to the silence of the lost children whose names were being recorded one by one. The room of truth had yielded its harvest, and it was a harvest of bones. The files began to pile up on the desk, each one a testament to a life cut short. The detectives knew their work was only beginning. They would have to travel to every field and every basement Ravinder had mentioned to find what remained of the children. But for now, they simply sat in the presence of the man who had counted the lost, a man who had walked among them, unnoticed and unstopped, for far too long. The morning sun was high in the sky, but for those in the Begumper station, the world had never felt darker. The confession was complete, the numbers were etched in ink, and the true scale of the monster of Noida had finally been dragged into the light of day. The detectives knew their work was only beginning. They would have to follow the monster into the very places where those lives had been stolen. In the heavy, humid heat of July 2015, a small caravan of white police vehicles wound its way out of the dense heart of the city, heading toward the sprawling outskirts of outer Delhi. In the back of one of those cars sat Ravinder Kumar. He was a man of slight build, barely 24 years old, but he carried with him the weight of 30 dark secrets. He did not look like a predator. He sat quietly, his eyes fixed on the passing landscape of dust and rising concrete, as if he were merely a traveler returning to familiar haunts. Beside him, investigators held their breath, the air in the car thick with the unspoken tension of what lay ahead. They were no longer just looking for a man. They were looking for the lost, guided by the very hand that had taken them. As the city buildings thinned out, they entered the badlands of Nerla and Bawana. This was a landscape of transition, where the reach of the urban world met the forgotten silence of the fields. Here, the ground was a patchwork of under-construction tenements, abandoned brick kilns, and vast, empty plots overgrown with tall, yellowing grass that hissed in the dry wind. Ravinder began to speak, his voice level and devoid of any tremor. He pointed a thin finger toward a cluster of trees near a drainage ditch. He remembered the year was 2008. He remembered the sweets he had used as a lure. The detectives watched as he described the scene with a chillingly accurate memory, detailing the placement of the sun and the specific sounds of a nearby construction site that had long since been completed. It was as if he had frozen time in these desolate pockets of the earth. The vehicles stopped near a stretch of wasteland in Samipur badly. The air here was heavy with the smell of stagnant water and the sharp, metallic tang of industrial dust. Forensic teams stepped out into the glare of the midday sun, their white suits stark against the brown earth. They carried shovels and sifting screens, moving with a slow, respectful solemnity. Ravinder led them past a pile of rusted iron rods to a patch of ground that looked like any other. He stood there, perfectly still, and said that this was the place. The investigators began the grueling work of clearing the brush. Every rustle of a plastic bag or snap of a dry twig sent a jolt through the group. They were searching for the smallest of traces, a scrap of faded fabric, a tiny plastic toy, or a fragment of bone that the earth had been trying to reclaim for 7 long years. Hour after hour, the search continued. The sun moved across the sky, casting long, skeletal shadows over the excavation site. The detectives worked in near silence, the only sound being the rhythmic scrape of metal against soil. There is a specific kind of quiet that settles over a crime scene when the truth begins to emerge from the dirt. It is a heavy, suffocating silence that feels as though the world is holding its breath. When the first piece of evidence was finally uncovered, a small, weathered garment partially buried in the silt, a ripple of somber recognition passed through the team. It was the physical proof of a tragedy that had once been just a line in a missing persons report. To Ravinder, it was a landmark in his dark history. To the detectives, it was the first step toward a closure that had been delayed far too long. But there was no time to linger. Ravinder had more stories to tell, and the caravan moved on. They traveled to Alipur, then to the desolate edges of Kanchawala. At each stop, the pattern repeated. The suspect would walk a few paces, look around to orient himself with a nearby landmark, a power pylon or a specific bend in a creek, and then point. He spoke of the years between 2009 and 2013 as if he were reading from a ledger. He led them to the septic tanks of buildings that had stayed unfinished for years, where the shadows were deepest and the air was coldest. The investigators found themselves descending into the dark, damp foundations of the city's expansion, realizing that for years, this monster had moved through these shadows completely unnoticed, a ghost among the laborers and the lost. By the time they reached the outskirts of Mundka, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. The search party was exhausted, their boots caked in the mud of a dozen different sites. Yet they pressed on. Every location Ravinder identified was another family that could finally be told the truth, however horrific that truth might be. The search for closure was not a single moment of discovery, but a long, agonizing journey through the landscape of a serial killer's mind. As the darkness of the night began to reclaim the fields of Outer Delhi, the detectives realized that the maps they were drawing were not just of crime scenes, but of a vast, hidden graveyard that had been hidden in plain sight for nearly a decade. The files on the desk were no longer just paper. They were now anchored to the earth, tied to the very spots where the light had gone out for so many. The long shadows of the Mundka outskirts slowly give way to a different kind of darkness, the sterile, heavy silence of the halls of justice. For years, the name Ravinder Kumar was whispered in the corridors of the Rohini courts, a name that became synonymous with a predatory terror that the city of Delhi had rarely seen. As we move from the dusty fields where the search began into the courtroom, the air feels cooler, thick with the weight of hundreds of pages of evidence. This was not just a trial for one life lost. It was an attempt to account for the stolen childhoods of at least 30 souls. The transition from the chaotic investigation to the orderly progression of the law was a slow, painful journey for the families involved. Imagine the flickering lights of the courtroom, the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall, and the rustle of legal papers that held the horrific details of a 7-year reign of terror. The forensic evidence was the cornerstone of this case, a grim mosaic of small, heartbreaking items recovered from the earth. Investigators spent months sifting through the soil in areas like Bawana and Bigumpur, looking for anything that remained. They found tiny fragments of clothing, a single shoe, and eventually the skeletal remains of children who had been missing for years. Each discovery was treated with a somber reverence. In the laboratory, the work was meticulous. DNA profiling became the silent witness that Ravinder could not silence. Technicians worked under the blue glow of microscopes, matching genetic markers from the recovered remains to the weeping parents who had waited in hope and agony. It was the science of the smallest things, a strand of hair, a stain on a discarded shirt, that finally built a bridge between the accused and his victims. These forensic links were essential because, in many cases, the passage of time had eroded the physical trails, leaving only the DNA to speak for those who could no longer speak for themselves. What made the legal proceedings truly extraordinary was the nature of the confessions. Ravinder Kumar did not just admit to his crimes. He described them with a chilling, vivid accuracy that stunned the investigators. He recalled specific dates, the exact clothes the children were wearing, and the precise locations where he had hidden them. He told the police that he would walk up to 40 kilometers a day, hunting through the slums and construction sites of the national capital region. This accuracy was a double-edged sword. It provided the police with the roadmap they needed to find the evidence, but it also revealed a mind that was profoundly disconnected from the gravity of its actions. In the courtroom, these confessions were presented as a sequence of horrors, mapping out a predatory path that stretched from Samipur Badli to the borders of Haryana and Uttar Pradesh. There was one moment in the trial that stood out as a profound instance of justice emerging from the deepest shadows. It involved a case from the village of Hathras in Uttar Pradesh. Years earlier, a 5-year-old girl had been murdered, and in a tragic miscarriage of justice, the local authorities had arrested her own father for the crime. The man had spent years in a living nightmare, accused of the unthinkable. However, during his interrogation, Ravinder Kumar described that specific crime in such haunting detail, mentioning landmarks and dates that only the killer could know, that the authorities were forced to reopen the case. His confession eventually led to the exoneration and release of that innocent father. It was a strange, bittersweet victory. The truth had finally set an innocent man free, but it had come from the mouth of the very person who had destroyed his family. As the trial reached its climax in May of 2023, the atmosphere in the Rohini court was electric with anticipation. Additional sessions, Judge Sunil Kumar presided over the final sentencing. The courtroom was packed with journalists, lawyers, and the families of the victims, their faces etched with the fatigue of an 8-year wait. The judge's words were sharp and uncompromising. He described Ravinder's actions as those of a predator who had shaken the very conscience of society. He noted that the crimes were committed with a level of depravity that merited no leniency. The court found him guilty of kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder under the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act and various sections of the Indian Penal Code. The sentence was life imprisonment, a life for many lives, ensuring that the man who had haunted the outskirts of Delhi would never again walk free among the vulnerable. Despite the finality of the sentence, Ravinder Kumar remained a figure of chilling coldness. Throughout the proceedings, he showed no remorse, no tears, and no guilt. He had once told investigators that if he had not been caught, he would have simply continued his hunt. This lack of humanity was perhaps the most difficult thing for the families to witness. As the gavel fell and he was led away to serve his sentence, the legal chapter finally closed, but the scars he left on the community remain deep. The justice served in the shadows of that courtroom was a necessary reckoning, a way to formally acknowledge the lives that were so cruelly taken. The fields of Mundka are quiet now, the secrets they held finally brought into the light of the law. The predator is caged, and though the healing is slow, the families can finally look toward a horizon where the shadows no longer hold his name. The heavy oak doors of the Rohini court finally swung shut in May of 2023, marking the end of a legal marathon that had spanned nearly 8 long years. Inside those walls, the air had been thick with the weight of names spoken and secrets unearthed. But outside, in the sprawling, dust-choked neighborhoods of Samipur Badli and Bigumpur, the silence was different. It was a silence born of exhaustion. For the families of the children who had vanished between 2008 and 2015, the sentencing of Ravinder Kumar was not a moment of sudden light, but rather a long drawn-out sunset. The predator, a man who had once moved through these very streets as an invisible laborer, was now a permanent resident of a prison cell, sentenced to life until his natural breath would cease. Yet, as the gavel fell, the echoes of his confessions lingered in the stagnant heat of the afternoon, leaving a community to wonder how much of the darkness had truly been cleared away. To understand the aftermath, one must walk the narrow lanes where the children once played. These were the children of the hardworking poor, the sons and daughters of laborers who spent their days building the rising skyline of Delhi, while their own lives remained anchored in the shadows of construction sites and industrial hubs. For these parents, memory is a physical ache. They remember the texture of the small hands they once held, and the way the sun caught the dust as their little ones ran toward the promise of a sweet. Ravinder Kumar had used that very innocence against them, luring his victims with treats and coins, tiny, sparkling bribes that led to the desolate edges of a dried-up canal. Today, that canal stands as a grim monument to the lost. The grass grows tall and yellow there now, swaying in the wind, a place where the laughter of 30 children was extinguished. The families do not visit it. Instead, they keep small, faded photographs tucked into the frames of mirrors, the edges worn thin by years of desperate touch. The legacy of this investigation is one of both triumph and deep, systemic frustration. When Ravinder was first apprehended in July of 2015, following the tragic discovery of a 6-year-old girl in a half-finished building, the scale of his depravity stunned even the most seasoned investigators. He had spoken of 30 murders, perhaps more, describing the locations with a chilling, drug-fueled precision that made the skin of the listeners crawl. He spoke of his own internal shifts, how alcohol turned him into a different person, a shadow that felt no remorse. But the law, with its rigid requirements for physical evidence, could only truly catch him for a fraction of his admissions. While he confessed to dozens, he was only formally charged and convicted in 3 major cases. For the families of the other 27 children, justice remains a ghostly concept, recognized in the heart, but never fully inscribed in the ledger of the state. This creates a lingering tension in the air of Samipur Badly, a feeling that while the monster is caged, the full story of their loss remains unfinished. The impact on the community has been profound. In the years following the arrest, the atmosphere of the neighborhood changed. The easy trust that once defined the communal courtyards has been replaced by a quiet, watchful vigilance. Mothers no longer let their children stray more than a few feet from their sight, even in the golden hours of the early evening. The Badlands of Outer Delhi, as some have called them, are now mapped by memories of where the police once dug for remains and where the search parties once gathered with flashlights. There is a collective scar here, a trauma that has passed from one generation to the next. Even the new residents, those who arrived long after 2015, can feel the weight of it. They see the way the older neighbors glance toward the vacant lots or the dark corners of the industrial estates. It is a legacy of fear that has solidified into a permanent part of the local identity, a whisper in the night that warns of the dangers that can hide behind a familiar face. As we look back at the case of Ravinder Kumar, we see more than just the profile of a serial offender. We see a mirror held up to the vulnerabilities of a society. The investigation forced a reckoning within the police departments regarding how missing children reports from poor families were handled. It sparked conversations about the lack of mental health resources for those lost in the cycle of addiction and labor. But for the host of families left in his wake, these structural changes are small comfort. They are left with the silence of the rooms where their children should have grown up. They are left with the knowledge that a man who walked among them, who shared their streets and breathed their air, was capable of such profound cruelty. In the final accounting, the sentence of life imprisonment is a period at the end of a long, painful sentence, but for many, the page will never truly be turned. The shadows of those years remain, etched into the very soil of the city. The case rests now, Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.